Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the number of articles that are doing the rounds at the moment on video and in print and so on online. Talk about the Chinese government's supposed espionage activities and their general activities to undermine the Western world, and what are these activities, to what extent are they successful, why would the Chinese government be bothering to do this and invest so much in it, are their activities successful even from their point of view. So let's take a wider look at this and see where we go. Now I should say that when I first started international business traveling, the idea that China would be a major world power and that the West would transfer a lot of jobs to China or away from the West into China and India, that the West would openly allow Chinese manufacturing to become so dominant, would allow Chinese migration to be such a huge issue in the mass migration equation, that wasn't foreseen at the time. When I first started international traveling, then that wasn't really on the radar. The amount of Chinese new migrants you'd see in Australia, for example, there was some going to America, but the amount going to Australia was very small. The work visa permits, things like that, it was a very minor issue. So none of the things that later became, the mass migration, all this sort of stuff, none of those things that became big issues in the years to come were really on the radar at the time. There were murmurings in think tanks, but that's about all. And I was a young guy when I first started doing it, so I was going to places like the Malaysia, which has a large Chinese population, Singapore, which is primarily Chinese, and quite even then you could see that Singapore was going places. Taiwan, Hong Kong, and so on. Different in mainland China. So when I first started traveling, the Chinese have this manner of ingratiating themselves, which involves that their culture is to kowtow to authority. That is to get on your knees and bang your head on the stone floor. Bang your forehead on the stone floor as an indication of your complete submission and prostration. And so this groveling, I found that very disconcerting. And so I remember the first time I saw it, I thought, whoa, what's going on here? But that's their way. So the white man at the time had the money, had the power. You could dispense money, dispense patronage. They wanted a piece of that action, the Chinese folks in these places. So they would go through the requisite groveling and crawling and so on. Less so in Taiwan, but anyway, that was then. And again, being a young guy, at the time, I sort of really didn't know how to deal with it. So I just had to kind of steer a middle course and smile and so on. Now, the Chinese culture is very, and wherever you find the Chinese diaspora across Asia, and it's extensive, by the way, but they're very much into sort of family. They revere their dead relatives and all that sort of stuff. So the man of the house is so it's, I wouldn't call it patriarchal necessarily, but it's out front as patriarchal. The women sort of scheme incredibly behind the scenes, but out front, the men are supposed to be in charge. So having a look at that, excuse me, that society, they had really not much concept of how Western society worked. It was strange, sort of in that sense that they, again, as the Chinese, wherever you are, they don't have the strong institutions, the independent institutions, the independent courts of law type structure that we have in the West, and democracy doesn't exist in any practical reality anyway. So the Chinese had a very, very different worldview, and again built around sort of family and tradition and those sorts of things. And if you come across a Chinese business, they'll employ second and third cousins before they'll employ anyone outside of the family. If a member of the family falls on stony times, it's an embarrassment if that family member is seen to be sort of on the street and begging type thing. So all the other family members will contribute money to that relative until they get back on their feet. Things like that, things you wouldn't really find in an Anglo-Saxon community. Anyway, that's the Chinese. So I was there right at before the change took place, and so I could see in real time the change from white man in charge to white man no longer in charge. I was right there throughout that whole process, and the difference was quite stark. When I first arrived, there was the grovelling and the kowtowing and calling me sir and all that sort of thing. And bear in mind, I was like 23 or something at the time. And to 10 years later, where the change was already well underway. And I mentioned before in videos where I was on a train going somewhere in some Chinese place, and I was getting rather malevolent stares from a group of what looked like, say, senior high school kids on the train. And I mean malevolent stares. And one of them got up and told me directly, the era of the white man is over. We, meaning the Chinese, we're going to be in charge now, and you won't be telling us anymore. We'll be telling you, and so on. But the vehemence and the intensity and the pent up anger. So let me talk a little bit about where does that come from. Let's talk about Chinese history now. When the white folks showed up, sort of really, it was in 1820s, 1830s when the white folks or the Europeans start showing up around Asia in any sort of serious representation. There'd been before that, like Marco Polo and all that sort of thing, but this was the slow coach going down the Silk Road, which went from China right through the Middle East, Asia, Turkey. And then into Europe and the Mediterranean and so on. So that was a very expensive, very long, very hazardous, difficult journey. And that was the trade with China and those sort of places. Then now, as the Europeans developed long ocean-going vessels, particularly the bigger vessels that could carry a decent amount of cargo, and particularly when steam and steam engines and so forth came along. But when the Industrial Revolution kicked off, the British and the West Europeans were looking for markets for their products. China was already very populous, so it was an obvious place to go and say, "Hey, do you want to buy our stuff?" Now, China at the time, so let's notionally sort of say 1830. China at the time was hopelessly corrupt in a state of almost permanent civil war. And if there was any lull in the civil war, it was brief. There were all sorts of rebellions, some of them actually looking like they were going to topple the whole structure, like the Taiping Rebellion and so on. But China was hopelessly corrupt, hopelessly fractured, and again in a state of civil war, much as India was when the Europeans turned up. So along come the British, and they try and trade with the Chinese, and they're sticking to the seaports and the major river. They can't really go inland outside of the seaports and the major rivers, and they really the Europeans had to develop special boats for navigating the rivers. More flat bottoms, not so much of a keel and that type of thing. So the local warlords, because it was all broken up into warlords and districts, again, terrible corruption. Corruption's a way of life in China and India and many places around it. Is it just how it is? Relative to the West, even a corrupt Western country is nowhere near as corrupt as these places. So they had to pay, the traders and the merchants had to pay the local warlords, and the graft of corruption was such that they pretty much couldn't sell their goods. If someone else would offer a bigger bribe, they would take that. So the Europeans got jack of this, and so they had various wars. Now the Chinese peasants and so smoked a lot of opium, and the Europeans were eager to supply the opium. And we'll come back to the modern day issue of Chinese government organising the delivery of fentanyl into the United States. So today the Chinese, in historical terms, draw parallels between the Europeans pushing opium onto the Chinese in the 1830s and fentanyl into the US today. I'll come back to that later, though. Now, the Chinese were opposed to the opium, not because they were opposed to the opium. In some respects, they were, because the heavy opium smokers weren't very good workers, and the Chinese sort of have a lot of slave peasant labour that they wanted to use, for the warlords and the goons and the corrupt for their purposes. And if all these people were getting nuked on opium, it kind of made it just a bit harder for them to rustle up and hustle up a willing workforce that would do what they were told. So there was that element. But more importantly was that the British wouldn't pay, or the Europeans wouldn't pay, the corrupt payments to the warlords. That was the real sort of issue here. The warlords were outraged by this, and hey, you got to pay me my fucking bribe. And the Europeans, yes, that right. And so superior European technology and gunboats and all that sort of thing won the day, and the trading agreements, including the sale of opium, were imposed on the Chinese. And also the Europeans were exacting, in effect, reparations. That, some of these trading agreements are quite one-sided. Nonetheless, that was the Chinese in return got advanced Western technology, and so there were things like that. So it did go two ways to some extent, but. Now, the Chinese, in historical sense, they teach this in the schools. It's very much part of their understanding of the world, the Chinese, and they see it as a central issue to their concept of history and the timeline of history. They call this time 1830 to the time when the communists took over in 1949. They refer to this generically as the 100 years of humiliation, where the barbaric, morally and culturally inferior Western barbarians, the white devils, the ghost eyes, where the Europeans humiliated China. And some of these, when you look at, say, something called the Boxer Rebellion, Boxer, the Boxer Rebellion, and they were part of what the Chinese called the Righteous and Harmonious Brothers, I think they call themselves. And the Boxer Rebellion in sort of 1900 was certainly threatening to European interests. And so a multinational European force went in and they got out of control. They went into the Chinese Forbidden City, which is like the seat of the emperors, and trashed it and stole stuff and vandalized it. It was not a good chapter in history at all. One of the greatest wonders, I think, one of the greatest cultural and historical wonders in the world. And the Chinese emperor had already lost all power, pretty much. In the Forbidden City, acres upon hundreds of acres of imperial and regal splendor. To me, that should have been absolutely preserved and protected. Anyway, that was all trash. So this was just yet another humiliation for the Chinese. Bear in mind, China's in again a permanent state of civil war, warlords trying to nuke each other and so on. So it's not like a peaceful, harmonious country was being invaded by goons and barbarians. It wasn't like that. The place was in uproar before the Europeans came along. And it was the inability of the Chinese government to restore law and order, which to a large extent at least brought the Europeans in. Nonetheless, the Chinese see this as the 100 years of humiliation, and they see Europeans, the ghost eyes. The Chinese revere their ancestors and the ghosts in Chinese mythology all have these blue see-through eyes, not the denser brown eyed. So they call the Europeans ghost eyes, Kuai Huayla, ghost eyes. So this is the 100 years of humiliation. Now, the Chinese today are taught, every kid's taught this in school, and again, it's something that stirs great emotion within the patriotic Chinese, is that the Europeans humiliated the Chinese. These inferior peoples, these culturally and spiritually, morally inferior peoples humiliated the Chinese. Why did they humiliate the Chinese? Only because we were in civil war and we were stabbing each other in the back. But if we stay unified, says the government today, or since 1949, 50, if we stay unified, then these ghost eyes will never be able to do that to us again. And more importantly, we'll be able to hold them accountable for what they did to us 100 years ago. So it's the same sort of mentality. You wonder whether it comes out of the same book, but the mentality of the slaves, slavery, the fact that the Africans enslaved each other, that's a mere detail. It was those damn fucking white fucking Europeans. They did it. Only they did it. Those fucking Nazis. So there's very much a movement to focus only on the white involvement in slavery and to just simply rinse away the fact that the blacks enslaved each other, that the Arabs were enslaving blacks for 1,000 years before the white folks got anywhere near it. The North African Barbary Arabs were enslaving millions of white people. Let's forget about that. So this idea of the narrative of the evil Westerners, which has been ginned up since the communists took government in China, but nonetheless it was there before the communists came along. So the idea is to punish the West for its wickedness, for the 100 years of humiliation. Now, so you have a look at the Chinese activists or journals that say, well, look what the Europeans did to us, selling opium, drugs into China in 1830 or the 1830s and beyond. So what's wrong with us selling fentanyl into the United States? Look how the Europeans just requisitioned land from us in when they came along, taking Hong Kong Island and Kowloon and Macau and so on, and effectively owning Shanghai and turning it into a European city. Why can't we acquire land in Western countries? Why can't we own half of Manhattan Island or half of downtown Sydney? Or what's wrong with that? The Europeans did it to us 100 years ago. Well, why can't we do it today? And so on and so forth. So this feeds into their overall narrative that not only are Chinese entitled to do it, and to use high-handed or underhanded rather means in doing it, but it's payback for the humiliation of Chinese subjects. So they don't see, we're not doing anything wrong. Now, on top of that, again, even today, the Chinese society is incredibly corrupt. As indeed it is in India and Philippines and all these places where the West is sourcing migrants, the surplus population, bringing in people where corruption, corruption at all levels is a way of life. You want to get someone to change your light bulb, or you have to bribe, pay a bribe to some government official. And we're bringing these people in by the multi-million, and we're not making them less corrupt. They're making us in the West more corrupt at a political level, at a local government level, NGO level, at every level. So this is something that we need to understand in the wider sort of sweep of history. Now, is it sensible to, for example, if I want to go and buy land outside of the West, if I want to go buy land in pretty much any country, then I can't do it. I've either got to, I can lease it long term, or I have to buy it with a local partner, and I can't own more than 50% of the land and this sort of thing. In other places where I can buy land, again, outside of the West, I can only sell it for what I paid for it as a maximum, and I have to pay a decent transactional tax to the government. So, buying real estate just really isn't worth it. Now, in the West, it's different because Chinese, Indians, Russian mafia goons, all that sort of thing, they can buy land in the West and use all sorts of proxies and offshore companies and dummy companies. They can use a wide variety of devices to purchase land. And now in China, there are suburbs in Sydney where just one Chinese guy through nominees and front companies can own 200 or 300 fucking properties. One of the wealthiest suburbs in Australia. The Chinese, it's just one Chinese guy owns like a sixth of all the properties in that neighbourhood. So the list goes on of transactions and owning of property, not simply residential property, by the way, but things like shopping centres and farming land. That's another extensive one. There are shopping centres in Sydney where strip malls, shopping centres, where a Chinese dummy investment or a dummy company, which is really a Chinese government investment company, has bought up the shopping mall, and they just arbitrarily apply brutal rents to any non-Chinese person until they've moved all the Western people out, and they've just stacked it with Chinese tenants. And the Chinese, very much, you can only buy and spend money within their own diaspora. So you have to if you want some repair work done to your shop, you have to go to a Chinese supplier. If you want to stock your shop with merchandise, you can only go to a Chinese supplier. If you're going to eat lunch, you can only go to a Chinese restaurant, and so on and so on. And so they keep their money within the diaspora using methods of intimidation and standover. They've got no qualms about threatening your relatives in China if you don't comply, all sorts of things like that. So this is the Chinese thing today. So by running parallel economies, by running drugs, fentanyl as an example, running drugs into the West. Now the Chinese could argue, well, we don't force people to take the fentanyl. If there are that many feckless white people that want to nuke themselves on fentanyl, that's not our problem. We're just supplying the product. Hey, we believe in capitalism. So there's you can look at sort of both sides of it in that sense. Nonetheless, the running of fentanyl is technically or supposed to be illegal, and yet it seems to be something that no one can stop, or other drugs for that matter, not just that. Now, the other thing is the amount of people that are waved into the West in the mass migration scams. A lot of Chinese in there, and many of those are government operatives. Something that sort of came across, there was an anti-Chinese government protest about Tibet or something like that. I can't remember what it was now. And I was stunned at just how quickly the Chinese could rustle up a counter demonstration, as in a pro-Chinese government demonstration, using people in Australia. How are they able to get so many people on the streets so quickly? Placards, the whole 9 yards, and right in the correct the area where the other demonstration was. How are they able to do that? So this would suggest or imply that there's a lot of Chinese students or even Chinese people living in Australia that are very pro-China. I don't know how many of these people are sort of part of the wider Chinese diaspora. Now, one of the things that the Chinese government's been coming out with over the last 20 years or so is China as not simply a nation state, but as a cultural state. So wherever Chinese culture is practiced, Chinese New Year, the dragon dancing, all that sort of stuff, wherever Chinese New Year or Chinese culture rather is expressed, is effectively part of Greater China. So wherever there's a Chinatown, for example, wherever Chinese people are a prominent minority, that effectively becomes part of Greater China, and the Chinese government is allowed to, or as they see it, they thus have permission in their interpretation of this cultural diaspora thing to really lecture, or not simply to lecture, but to dictate what happens in these places where the Chinese culture exists. Now that's a scary thought. If you take that to its logical sort of conclusion, that means the Chinese are wanting to go back to like the early 1500s, where effectively every nation in the world has to send representatives to bow down before the great emperor and hand over gifts and so on. So that's not a good, and I think that's probably where it's heading at the moment, particularly given this grievance about the 100 years of humiliation and Chinese destiny is what they would see the Middle Kingdom. So they're the intermediary between the barbarians here and heaven on the other side. That side. So the Middle Kingdom is they see themselves as the apex of all civilization, which is something of a stretch for such a corrupt place. But anyway, so when we look at that in its entirety, China is in a position through economic influence, through mass migration, and through the fact that the West has very foolishly, in my view, transferred so many manufacturing and industrial jobs to China, therefore artificially strengthening China. China wouldn't be even half as wealthy as they, not even close to being half as wealthy today, if the foolish globalizing West hadn't decided to move all those jobs there to China and to weaken the West and to strengthen China without really getting anything in return. Low quality manufactured goods that fall apart as soon as you look at them. Is that or clothes where the dye runs out of them after a couple of washes? Is that the benefit the West has got? So just looking at this, is it a plan to undermine the West and to weaken it? I don't that those thoughts are going through the minds of the Chinese government, I think. But I think they're looking at the West saying, well, look at all these things the West is doing to weaken itself. Why don't we just help that along? Why don't we just grease those wheels so the West, self-destructs maybe more efficiently, more quickly than they would have done? But they're only aiding and abetting, as I see it, at least, a trajectory of decline that the West was already on. And again, if they're helping that along or encouraging it or financing it or now, other people have come and said, well, look at the industrial espionage. The Chinese have stolen Western industrial secrets, technical secrets, technology, and weapons of war, and medical breakthroughs, this sort of thing. I suppose to some extent they have. I've never been impressed by Chinese business people or Chinese operatives in any way. Never have they impressed me. And I've worked with a shitload of them, not only in Australia, but all over the world. And I am yet to be impressed. I'm yet to come away thinking, gee, that's a really smart guy, or that guy really knows his stuff. Now, this includes people who've supposedly got PhDs from Harvard and the like. But I have worked with some Chinese research scientists, and I am impressed with their ability to focus in their work, focus with great intensity on a particular sort of narrow subject and pursue it in great detail for the purposes of research. And some of the work I think they've done has been very, very good, very impressive. But outside of that, and outside of only a very small number of people there, nothing's ever impressed me. So I don't think the Chinese have got some incredible ability to pull it all off, or because they're smarter. And I don't think that. They've got a certain amount of narrow logic in a very narrow pathway. That again, as with the research scientists, I thought, oh, that's rather clever. But outside of that, no. In business, in negotiation, in economics, in pretty much any field where I've encountered Chinese people, they're not impressed in any way. So I don't think they've got the innate ability to change it. If the West collapses of its own accord, which is doing a pretty good job of doing right now, then China could step in to the vacuum. But can they do it? No, I don't think so. Anyway, that's an overview of what's happening with China, and I hope that adds a bit of information to your understanding. You've been with Tacitus today, and thank you for listening.